Hello and welcome to the Hoover Institution's 2014 Southern California Conference. I'm Chris Dower, Hoover's Director of Marketing and Strategic Communications. Our speaker in this video is Ohanian, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor of economics and director of the Ettinger Family Program in Macroeconomic Research at UCLA. The title of his talk is Getting the U.S. Economy Back on Track with Better Economic Policies, and it was recorded on January 30th, 2014.
Morning. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to join you today and share ideas about our current economy. And it's obviously a critical time in our country's history for our economy. We will be having midterm elections this fall. And before we know it, we'll be looking at electing a new president. And as you know, economics always figures prominently into how elections resolve, into what direction our country goes forward in. What I'll do this morning is tell you a little bit about where we stand from the standpoint of our economy and describe where I think we should be, and discuss some economic policy shifts that, in my opinion, will help us get back on track and restore prosperity. Okay, so let me go ahead and begin by showing you just a snapshot of economic performance. Economists usually think about inflation-adjusted gross domestic product, GDP, per person as the usual barometer for measuring economic performance in our country. And our economy, sort of up until recently, year in and year out, on average, grew about 2% per year per person. Now, at first glance, this doesn't sound like an awful lot, but because of the magic of compound growth, what 2% means is that living standards, GDP per person, inflation adjusted, doubles every 36 years. And with current U.S. life expectancy of around 80 years, that means a child born today, if we continue to grow 2% per year, we'll see about a five-fold increase in living standards. And the fact that we've been able to achieve this really since the birth of our country is why the U.S. is the wealthiest major economy in the world. No other country has compiled that type of record of economic success. But, we have an issue here, and you can see what the issue is. What I've done is I've drawn in here a red dashed line, which would be where our economy would be if we had continued on this 2% trend growth year after year. And what I've done is I've normalized quarter four of 2007, which is right before we started our last severe recession, as 100. And you can see how those numbers grow. And you see what appears to be almost a parallel shift between the red dash line and then the blue, which is where we actually are. That's our actual inflation-adjusted per capita GDP. And you can see that we had a severe recession. We fell down substantially, but we haven't recovered back to that trend. And this is the only time in the 200-plus year history of our country that we have not recovered following a recession. Now, to put this in more concrete terms, we are about, if you look at that graph and you can kind of do the math, we are about 8% below trend. And we have about a $17 trillion economy, so 8% below trend means we're losing about $1.3 trillion per year. And we've been losing that $1.3 trillion per year, plus or minus, now for about 5 years. Okay, so that's truly a very substantial waste and relative to potentially what our economy could achieve. And again, when you look at that picture, there's no sense in that we're having really any tendency to come back to that red dash line. And our goal is to try to figure out how to get us back to that red dash line, how to get us back on track. Now, the next picture I'm going to show you is even a little bit more dire. It shows employment, so the number of individuals working divided by the 16 to 64 population. So most countries consider the working age population to be 16 to 64, so I've used that same metric. And in an economy like ours, when we're successful, jobs grow at roughly the same rate as population. And you can see that was the case between the early 2000s up until around 2007, quarter four. And then you see there's a very substantial decline in employment, about 8% drop in employment. And what you see is there's really been no recovery. There's been no recovery in jobs, measured as a fraction of the adult population. Now, what I've also done in this picture is I've drawn in the titles and dates of various government programs that were intended to stabilize and grow the economy. And you can see some that, you can see Cash for Clunkers, which was about a $4,000 subsidy to individuals who purchased new cars and traded in an old car. There's the new home buyers tax credit that was intended to support the housing industry, and they gave tax credits between $7,500 to $8,000 per year for individuals purchasing a home. The ARRA was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, more commonly known as the stimulus program. That was about $900 billion. You see QE 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those were various programs put in place by the Federal Reserve called quantitative easing. Quantitative easing simply refers to the Federal Reserve's purchases of long-term Treasury bonds, which they typically had not done very much of before 2008, and also purchases of mortgage-backed securities and other types of assets. And all of these programs were intended to try to get the economy back on trend, but you can see that they don't appear to have done much. Jobs fell about 8%, and they've stayed about 8% below where they should be, and we remain about 80% below trend in terms of economic growth. Now, these programs were expensive. So President Obama's stimulus plan was when all is said and done, about $900 billion. Cash for Clunkers was expensive. The home buyers tax credit was expensive. Various payroll tax holidays were expensive. So what I've shown you here is the cost of those programs. The cost of those programs is publicly held federal debt as a fraction of GDP. That's how we usually measure it. And you can see we've gone from about 35%. It was stable around 30 to 35% for a long time. And then it grew substantially over the last 5 years and has roughly doubled. It's 70 to 75%. Okay, so we're concerned about these numbers. In my opinion, they're not quite at the level that we should be as concerned as, say, some countries in Western Europe should be concerned. One reason is because Western Europe does not grow very much at all, and we have the potential to grow, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But this is something to be concerned about. Okay. Now, I mentioned that we've never had an economic situation where we didn't have a recovery. And in fact, our recoveries following severe recessions, such as the 2008-2009 recession, recoveries following severe recessions are typically much faster than recoveries following shallower recessions. Now, because we had so much economic success from the early 1980s up until about 2008, so we had roughly about a 25-year period of remarkable economic growth and remarkable economic stability. And fortunately, we have to go back to the early 1980s for the last severe recession. That was a period in which unemployment was as high as 11%. Some of you remember that mortgage rates were 17 and 18%. Inflation was 11 and 12%. It was a very, very difficult economic time. But despite those challenges, we had a very fast recovery following the 1980-81 recession. And I've drawn it in here. The red dashed line, that's always that 2% growth rate that we historically have achieved. And then the blue is actual GDP. And you can see we had a severe recession. We lost about 4% of GDP, very substantial recession. But then we caught up. We caught up very, very quickly. It took us only about 6 quarters to catch up. Well, now, we're 32 quarters into recovery in this period, and we have not caught up at all. Now, what happened in that early 1980s period? Well, here's a picture of unemployment. As I mentioned, unemployment was about 11% at its peak, and it fell very, very quickly. And the reason unemployment fell so quickly is because jobs returned very quickly. So here's a picture of employment, and you can see there's a large drop in employment, but it was followed by a very, very fast restoration of jobs. Okay, so contrast that with the picture I just showed you. Jobs have not come back at all. And some of you recall discussions about, will we have a V-shaped recovery after the 2008-2009 recession? Well, this is what people were hoping for. That's your V-shaped recovery. You go down and you come back very quickly. Okay, we haven't had that. In fact, we have really had no recovery whatsoever in jobs. And this is truly a crisis for the country. There's a lot of people looking for work. There are some people who are sufficiently discouraged from not finding a job that they left the labor force. So in some level, this is kind of job number one as an economist, to try to think about getting employment back. Now, a number of you have probably heard, well, we can't have a recovery until the housing sector gets sorted out. Well, that arithmetic doesn't really add up. And the way to think about this is this next picture shows how much was spent on residential construction activity over the last few years. And you can see by looking at that chart that there's an enormous drop, but most of that drop occurred between 2005 and late 2007. Much of that drop occurred before the recession even really started. There was certainly a recession in the construction industry, but there wasn't a broader recession in the economy. What you see now is that since 2011, residential construction is actually increasing. And what that means is that it is now a positive contributor to economic growth. Okay, so we can no longer say that housing is holding our economy back. It's actually contributing economic growth. That's not to say the housing sector is a healthy one, but simply just to say that more dollars are being spent in the housing industry now than they were last year, the year before that. So, where does this leave us? We have a very weak economy, one that doesn't appear to be improving at all in terms of jobs, and one that seems to be almost permanently stuck about 8% below, where I think we should be. So now let's talk about some ideas to improve jobs and get us back to that red dashed line, that 2% line. And I'm guessing that some of these pictures I'm showing you, in particular for jobs and for economic growth, they may be very different than what you have been hearing from the media. And in other stories, you'll hear about things like the Federal Reserve will say, we're delighted that unemployment has dropped to, in the low 7% range from, nearly 10%. Well, there's two reasons why unemployment can fall. One reason is because people leave the labor force. The second reason is that more people are taking jobs. So as an economist, I rarely talk about the unemployment rate because it can confound those two very different forces. You can see from this picture that the drop in the unemployment rate that you've heard so much about, it is not because more people are taking jobs. Rather, it is because people are leaving the labor force. And again, that's not a healthy sign. We want more people in the labor force. And in fact, if I had graphed this picture over a broader time path of history, and we compared this over decades, we have the lowest job rate, number of people working divided by the population. We have the lowest job rate since the 1970s and the period of oil crises, high inflation, very high interest rates, low productivity growth. Okay, so let me take my remaining time and share with you some ideas for trying to get us back on track, improve that employment picture, and improve our economic growth picture. And the second comment I'm going to make that may be somewhat of a surprise to you, I know it's not a surprise to all of you, is that our current economic weakness is not just a consequence or is not just a feature or a symptom of our last recession, the 2008-2009 recession. Rather, we have, in my opinion, more serious problems than just coming out of what was a severe recession. The reason I say that is that even before that 2008-2009 recession, years 2003, 2004, up through 2006, those were, some people call, boom years. Well, those are years in which the most critical components of economic growth, new business formation and job creation, were 30% lower. 30% lower than they were in the 1980s. About 20% lower than the 1990s. So we have more than a decade of underlying economic weakness. And that's why I think it's critical to think about really making progress on long-run policy objectives, as opposed to a variety of short-run band-aids and attempts to fix the economy that I think have dominated policymaking since 2008. Now, I think almost all economists will tell you that the best barometer for future economic success is productivity growth. Productivity growth simply refers to the percentage change in how much output is produced by our workers. Today, average worker produces over $100,000 per year of output. It's truly remarkable. There's no other major country in the world that has that type of success record. Our standard of living, GDP per person, has increased by a factor of 65-fold increase since the birth of our country. Now, income rises for just one of two reasons. Either more people are working or they're more productive. And almost all of that 65-fold increase has come from productivity growth. That's the result of risky, tangible, and intangible investments made by individuals in accumulating human capital, made by businesses in investing in new technologies and plant and equipment, and made by governments investing in infrastructure and improving institutions. Since 1948, the average growth rate of productivity in the business sector in the United States has been 2.5%. That means we double productivity every 28 years. Since 2010, that productivity growth rate has fallen to 1.1%, less than half. Okay. This is a substantial problem that I can't overemphasize. So I just mentioned that at 2.5% per year, we double every 28 years. At 1.1% per year, we double every 65 years. So this is a fundamental long-run aspect of our economy that's very, very undesirable, and one that we really need to address, and one that I don't think some of you probably haven't heard much about. I'll have an op-ed coming out in the Wall Street Journal probably in the next week or two that'll talk about these issues in detail, about productivity growth and how this is dragging our economy. So we have these long-run aspects of economic weakness in the U.S., but all's not lost. We have been a successful economy, the most successful major economy, because historically we have had the best economic policies that have promoted incentives for businesses to invest in plant and equipment and technologies, for individuals to accumulate human capital, and sensible government policies that enhance those incentives and facilitate business. So let's talk about some long-run reforms that I think will get us back on track. These are policy proposals that I feel strongly about, but I think there's fairly broad agreement among economists that we should be reforming these different areas. There's maybe some disagreement about the details, but there's generally broad agreement, which I think is a big positive, because when there is broad agreement, you hope that we can achieve some bipartisan consensus and get some things done. Okay, so let's talk about some of those policy reforms. reforming tax policy. So I'll list them here, and then I'll present some details in a few minutes. So reforming tax policy. We all know that the tax code has become just this Rube Goldberg mess over the years as different interest groups have lobbied Congress for different types of benefits and exemptions. And there's broad agreement that a simpler tax code that removes a lot of distortions should be enacted. Cutting federal spending to free up some resources. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Reforming immigration law. In my opinion, this is, I think, the biggest free lunch facing U.S. policymakers. We have a new business formation rate, as I mentioned, is about a third lower than what it was in the 80s and 90s. Many of you have successful business careers, have grown businesses, hired people, have seen your enterprises grow substantially over the years. New business is where economic growth comes from. We're not creating enough new businesses, and we need to bring in bright and creative risk takers from other countries that want to do this. Paul talked in detail about reforming education, and the key thing here is that our students today are not competitive with their peers in other countries. And reforming regulation that I think many people agree that impedes innovation. Okay, so let me first begin with tax policy. Marginal tax rate, so the tax rate that any individual faces on their last dollar earned, is high for almost everybody. It's not just certain segments of earners. It is high for almost everyone. So about a year ago, I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal with a former colleague of mine, Edward Prescott, where we calculated average marginal tax rates, including not just federal income tax rates and state income tax rates, but we also incorporated into that measure the state and local sales tax rates that you pay. And we constructed a number to say, if you earn $1, how much goods and services can you buy? Well, for the average individual, if you earn another $1, you can purchase a little bit about 58 cents. Okay, so on that $1 you earn, you're able to purchase about 58 cents, with 42 cents going to other stakeholders. That's for the average. For the highest earners, and of course some of the highest earners are some of the most successful entrepreneurs that take risks, create new business, and hire new workers. Those individuals face tax rates of about 65% in high tax states such as California, New York, Massachusetts. Why is that number particularly troubling? I suspect I'm preaching to the choir when many of you are saying, yes, that number is troubling. But another reason why that number is troubling is because that's a number that you see in Europe. And Europe's run that experiment for us. So in economics, one of the challenges we face is that unlike chemists or physicists, we can't go to a lab and try out and see how some policy works. We have to look at real-world outcomes. And Europe has run that experiment. Europe has had tax rates in the neighborhood of 60, 65% for decades. And we know what the outcome is. The outcome is, just take a look at the one country in Europe that many portray as Europe's success story, which is Germany. The total number of hours worked in Germany, so take all the German workers, add up how many hours they worked during the year, compare that by population, divide by population, compare that to how much Germans worked in 1960. Let me just ask, how many think it's about the same? Okay. How many think it's down to about 20%? Okay. It's down 40%. That's Europe's economic success story, Germany. They work 40% less today than they did in 1960. France, 35% less today. Virtually every major Western European country has had that level of decline in labor. And the research, I've done the research, and a number of the other economists done, have identified tax as playing a fundamental role. It's not the only role, but it accounts for about over half of that decline. Okay, so the tax rates we face now are far too high. And you'll see a lot of discussion about inequality and poverty. It was the 50th anniversary of LBJ signing into legislation the war on poverty. We are unfortunately a society that penalizes work for the poorest earners. Because many assistance programs such as food stamps and the Children's Health Insurance Program and various other forms of assistance that we provide to poor families, because those are means tested and the means testing has not been designed very well, poor individuals face tax rates that can exceed 100%. So when we talk about, gosh, why can't we get some people off welfare? Many people move off welfare. But those who don't, we ask, what can we do better? We have to do this better because we're not giving them incentives. We're not giving them the incentives to do this. So let me talk in a little bit of detail about these various ideas. Okay, tax reform. In principle, this one's pretty easy. The reason I say it's pretty easy from an economic point of view is that we know what's wrong. Since Bill Clinton 20 years ago, every president has had a bipartisan tax reform commission, including before Clinton during Bush Sr. Every bipartisan commission has come to the same conclusion, including President Obama's bipartisan commission. Broaden the tax base. Right now, taxes occur on too small of a segment of the population. This means that the rates are too high, distorting their incentives, and broadening the tax base is fundamentally important. So every bipartisan commission has reached that conclusion. Reducing marginal tax rates to improve incentives. Every one of these bipartisan commissions has concluded that as well. Our corporate tax rate, which at a statutory level currently is 35%, is, I believe, the highest among all advanced countries. It no longer brings in as much revenue as you might think it would at 35% because there are many, many ways for clever corporations to avoid those taxes. And they should. They're going to use the law to the best of their advantage, but the corporate tax rate has become really obsolete. So there's, again, I would say unanimous agreement among economists that this needs to be cut and equalized. And in particular, equalizing the tax treatment of capital income generally. One year, General Electric paid no corporate taxes because they were able to take advantage of many, many tax rules. Small businesses that may be growing very quickly, they don't have access to all those different advantages. Fundamental purpose of economics is tax. If you're going to tax similar commodities at the same rate. Well, capital income from General Electric and capital income from a small but quickly growing company, it's the same thing. They should be taxed at the same rate. And then a last recommendation that comes from bipartisan tax committees is shift from an income tax, which distorts incentives to produce and invest and hire, to a sales tax. That's one part of taxes, probably about the only part of taxes that Europe got right. When you ask yourself, how can Europe collect so many taxes? If they try to do it all through income taxes, which is what we do, we don't really have a national sales tax. We have some national excise taxes, but they're very small. The only reason Europe can collect as much tax revenue as they do is because through consumption tax. And that's not to say we should soak consumers, but the good news about a consumption tax is that it does not penalize savings and investment. Income taxes do. Federal spending cuts. So we've all been there, and the conclusion is it's apparently a very politically tough problem because it never gets done. Yet the type of spending that we have in place now, I think 90%, maybe 95% of us would say that's nuts. So, do we really need a $155 billion Department of Agriculture? About half of 1% of employment now is on the farm. It used to be 60% when the Department of Agriculture was set up in the early 1880s. It made sense to have a Department of Agriculture then. I'm not even sure it makes much sense to have a Department of Agriculture now. Certainly not one that's $155 billion. Of that $155 billion, $25 billion are subsidies, pure subsidies. Subsidies that explain why the price of sugar in this country is about 3 times the price of the world price of sugar. Why is sugar so expensive here? It's because we have a very effective sugar lobby that has convinced Congress to put into place protection for them. In the absence of protection, the form of tariffs and quotas that allows U.S. sugar production to continue. In the absence of that protection, we wouldn't have a sugar industry, and a couple thousand people that work in the sugar industry would have to do something else. We wouldn't have a sugar industry because we would be too expensive to produce sugar. We would simply import it from other countries. Now, it's tough to say national security for sugar. That's why we have this protection. But sugar subsidies cost us about $900,000 per sugar worker per year. So some of us might say, oh, sure, let's try to protect not necessarily people in this room, but some people say, yeah, sure, we should try to protect the sugar producers. $900,000 per worker per year. We see similar types of subsidies in energy and housing. Again, government has kind of crept into the area of commerce by trying to pick winners and losers in production of agriculture, in production of energy, that really makes very little economic sense. You might ask, well, what else is so big in the Department of Agriculture? Well, food stamps are administered out of the Agricultural Department. There is a significant fight in Congress this year to move food stamps strategically out of the Department of Agriculture. Why is that? Because with food stamps in the Department of Agriculture, you have a friendly coalition of urban Democrats and rural Republicans that want to kind of keep the entire agricultural department going together. The current farm bill that's going to come out, food stamps are still in the agriculture department. Very little reform is going to take place, as opposed to about a year ago when many of us thought that there was an opportunity for real reform with agricultural subsidies and reducing the size of the ag department. If I had the presidency here, which I certainly don't, what would I recommend? I would say phase in cuts to all subsidies over the next 5 years, and only if a program really merits on the basis of a cost-benefit analysis should that subsidy continue. But the types of subsidies we have in place now benefit tiny fractions of the population at the cost of almost everyone else. And we just can't afford to continue to do this. But I don't see much in the way from Washington really making much progress here. I mentioned earlier that kind of the biggest free lunch facing Washington policymakers is immigration reform. I noted that the business startup rate is 30% lower today than it was in the 1980s. Now, half of high technology startups in the United States are founded by an immigrant. Half, 50%. Almost all of them are from China or India. Now, how do we allow people to immigrate to the United States for employment purposes? It's through a program called the H-1B visa program. And there's other programs as well, but the H-1B visa program is the major program. 65,000 slots per year that are restricted by country of national origin, which means that all those Chinese and Indians who want to start high technology startups, they can't get in here to do it. In fact, those 65,000 slots were oversubscribed within 5 days. 65,000 slots for an entire year, they were oversubscribed within 5 days. Luckily, there's acknowledgement among both Republicans and Democrats that immigration laws aren't working, that the restrictions we place on skilled immigration from the 1980s just don't make any sense anymore. And the Senate passed Bill 744 that would eliminate these types of caps on skilled immigration. Immigration is obviously a political hot button issue. A lot of it boils down to issues regarding illegal immigration, unskilled immigration, providing border security. I hope we can figure out a way in Washington to make immigration reform, to bring more skilled immigrants in this country. To give you an idea of how severe the problem is, there's an outfit called Blue Seed. Blue Seed is purchasing a large cruise ship and is going to anchor it 12 miles and 100 yards off the coast of San Francisco, international waters. And they've received, I think, 1,400 early applications from immigrants to live there. It's going to be like a little city at sea. Immigrants will live there, and they will take a boat into San Francisco, and then they will rent a car and drive down to Silicon Valley, and they will start businesses that way. That's how severe the problem is. We make it too difficult for skilled immigrants to come here, and if they do, if we can make that change, we'll have higher business formation, we'll have higher economic growth, and we will start making some progress on those jobs numbers we took a look at. So, to his credit, the president talked about passing immigration reform this year. I don't know if it will get done. It doesn't. There hasn't been an awful lot of movement past what the Senate did. Okay, I won't spend too much time on this since we had a wonderful presentation earlier, but I'll just add some personal remarks. So, for my generation, I think public education worked pretty well, and I think for some kids today, for many kids today, it doesn't. And Paul talked about how only about a third of our kids are proficient at science and math. And proficiency is not a particularly high bar. I think less than 10% of California kids are what would be performing at an advanced level. And our poorest states, competency is comparable to countries such as Bulgaria and Kazakhstan, very poor countries that have few resources to devote to the problem. So if we're going to be competitive in a global economy, we have to improve outcomes so that kids have the same opportunities as I had and others have had. We talked earlier about the importance of reforming teacher tenure. We earlier talked about out of 275,000 teachers in California, 2 were let go. The number for the country, I believe, is about 0.1% of teachers are let go each year. I just ask you, as many people who have a hand in business, can you name another industry where the dismissal rate is 0.1% of your work staff? It can take 5, 6, 7 years and $1 million to go through a lawsuit to eliminate a teacher. New Jersey is making some progress in this area. So New Jersey passed tenure reform, and I believe also seniority reform. So a few years ago in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin New Teacher of the Year was eliminated because she was a new teacher. It was her first year. Her performance, everyone agreed, was remarkable. Seniority rules said she had to be let go when Wisconsin cut the rolls of teachers. So that's another area in reform that I think is important. And New Jersey is pushing very hard. One of Governor Christie's agendas is for merit-based pay. So there's been research done by economists that indicates just having 1 year of a good teacher, just 1 year, expands earnings over a lifetime of $300,000. Just 1 year. And that replacing the poorest performing teachers with the average of what's left over would result in just enormous gains, as what Paul showed you. So Christie is pushing for this very hard in New Jersey. There's a lot of opposition to it among teachers' unions. But again, this is something I think we must demand have to happen. 50 years ago, Lyndon Johnson signed into, his, what some people would call his signature piece of legislation, which was the war on poverty. What's happened to the war on poverty? Well, the fraction of families who are considered to be in poverty is basically the same as it was today as it was when Johnson took office, about 15%. Now, the Census Bureau considers you to be in poverty if you're a family of 4 and you earn around $24,000 per year. What we have done is not provided enough opportunities for poor households. We have provided a lot of assistance. So as a country, we're happy to increase the standard of living of poor families. So that same $24,000 family earning their consumption is about $45,000 per year. That so you might say, how are they spending twice as much as they're earning? That's from the cash value of the various types of programs that are available. The food stamps, nutritional assistance, the earned income tax credit, child credits, children's health insurance program. That's how those consumption levels are sustainable. And you might think that, okay, well, we won the war on poverty if poor households of four are able to consume $45,000 per year of goods and services. Well, not in my opinion, because some of these families, not all of them, but some of them stay on substantial and permanent government assistance. And that's a loss, I think, for society, and particularly it's a loss for those people involved. So I'll do a number of pro bono types of talks like this. And a couple of years ago, I gave a talk about the economy and about opportunity in Compton, one of the poorest, highest crime areas in Los Angeles. And afterwards, a woman came up to me, African American woman, and she said, you probably think I'm going to criticize you, but I just wanted to tell you that I understand and appreciate everything you said. And she said, this is coming from, I'm a 35-year-old grandmother of three. And I just thought, and this is tragic. And she said, I've never worked. My kids didn't know their father. My grandchildren don't know their fathers. No one in my family I can ever remember really had much of a job. And I know that this is wrong. I wish it was different, but I don't know what else to do. And I just thought this is really sad. It's really particularly sad for her and her family. And one of the issues that we have structured with assistance is that, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, we penalize work. Economists talk about this thing called welfare cliffs. And a welfare cliff simply refers to the fact that if a person on assistance begins to work or takes a higher paying job, they suddenly and sharply lose different components of welfare benefits. So, for example, the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan, has calculated on average that there's about a 75% marginal tax rate, meaning you keep $1 out of $4, the other $3 you lose, and you lose these other $3 because these various assistance programs go away. You are no better off, you're slightly better off earning $30,000 a year than $4,000 a year. And the amount you're better off wouldn't cover your child care expenses. So that's just flat out wrong. That's just the wrong incentive. And that's from the CBO on average for a single parent with one child. In Pennsylvania, the Commissioner of Family Assistance in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania did a calculation for a single parent with two kids. He found out that you're actually worse off earning $60,000 than earning $20,000. And you're worse off earning $32,000 than earning $5,000. We're penalizing work. I think it's just wrong. And we need to change that. What should we do? Create enterprise zones in poor neighborhoods. I think we should eliminate the marriage penalty for receiving welfare assistance. The president's discussing raising the minimum wage. This is just a huge obstacle to young people that don't have jobs. African American unemployment was 50% last year. These are African American kids who are looking for a job. Raising the minimum wage is not going to help them find work. So a training wage and apprenticeship programs would help there. But the best remedy for poverty is economic growth and educational reforms. Let me just conclude with a couple of pictures. Changes can be had, and we can restore prosperity. And a big plus for us is that our population will continue to grow. Young people are vital for restoring economic growth and continuing economic growth. So this picture shows you what the UN projections are for the U.S. population as we go out. Europe and Japan is not such a rosy picture. Japan is already starting to decline in terms of population, and Europe will by in about 10 to 12 years. So in terms of competing with other advanced countries, we are in a fundamentally much better position. And if we can make some policy changes, we'll even be better off.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution. Thank you for listening.